Much for your time today. It's a very topical subject. There's been a bit of a confluence of events, is what I would say. In January, we had Oxfam International and then Oxfam Australia talk about the inequality that the report that they do every year. And then at the end of January, we had our first ever Wellbeing Economy Alliance Reclaim the Economy Week. And of course, all Australians were on holidays, so we didn't do anything this year, but we hope to manage something in the first year of February when everyone's back at work and has caught up. And then we also had, and some of you would have seen this or been involved, we had Gary Stevenson from Gary's Economics touring Australia and New Zealand and discussing why this inequality keeps growing and what we can do about it. And he says it in a very simple manner. And Adrian was there and a few others, and she did a really great takeaway. So maybe you can share that, Adrian, with people if they wish, the document you did. But we've planned this webinar for a while. Like I spoke to Jane about it last December. And so it just seems kind of really timely, even though we were planning it back then, that we're doing it now because we've been talking about it. There's a real feeling of let's do something. The possibility is there. We have Treasury talking about capital gains tax, housing, interest rates. Again, those are always being talked about, but tax reform is being talked about, which is amazing. So we are really happy to put this on. And I think this is just a beginning of our conversation with this group, and we'd love to continue. So we'll be recording this session too to make sure that people that can't make it today can watch it later. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce all of our wonderful experts all at once, and then they'll be handing off to each other, and then we'll be opening it up for questions from everyone. And the experts will talk for about 5 minutes each. And then, as I said, we'll open it up for questions from everyone. So, first of all, we have Jane Bodie with us. After a decade in the global nonprofit sector, championing grassroots development in East Africa, Jane's returned back to Australia, which is our bonus to tackle economic inequality at home. She's the general manager of Think Forward, which a lot of you might be familiar with, but she can talk a little bit more about it. She combines her system thinking lens and MBA learning to really look at how current economic policy is shaping society and advocating for change, and has a real intergenerational fairness lens. And then we also have with us today Professor Helen Hodgson. We've got an absolute expert in taxation, so we're very excited about that. Professor Helen Hodgson is based at Curtin Law School. Her research is in areas of what we'll be talking about today, which is tax and social policy and where they intersect, superannuation, housing, and inequality. And she has contributed significantly to policy review in these areas. So we've got the right expert at the right time. And a lot of you will know Warwick Smith. He's in our calls quite often because he is a guru in well-being economy. He's the research director at the Center for Policy Development. He's also an ecological economist, which is quite nice to have that combination. And he's a writer, a researcher, a philosopher. He also is involved in, I would say, local economic development, community well-being with his work in Castlemaine Institute, and also the co-op that's been formed to buy the community building and beyond to keep the assets in the public hands. So with that, I'll just set the scene really quick. And thank you, experts, for coming. It's so nice to have you here. So Oxfam, with their report in January, they specifically to Australia, they showed that wealth inequality was at a 70-year high, with the nation's 48 billionaires as of early 2026 controlled more wealth than the bottom 40% of the population. So we're a little bit better than the national average, but it's still not looking great because of that 70-year high. Billionaire wealth is increased by an average of over 600,000 per day in 2025, The richest 1% accumulated 10 more times wealth than the bottom 50% over the past decade. Tax disparities indicate that high income earners and corporations are undertaxed, with 91 individuals earning over 1 million paying no tax in 2022, 23. So I guess that's setting the scene. We all know about our housing issues, potential even more increases to the interest rates. So each expert will talk about, their area of expertise. So I will hand it over to you, Jane, to get started. What can we do? Is our economy equitable? And we'll be talking about what we can do and also. So over to you, Jane.
Sure. Thank you, Di, and hello, everyone. You mentioned a lot at the beginning, talking about timely events, and I actually had a visit from my two best friends over the weekend, and I wanted to use this opportunity to sort of share a story about them, and why I was drawn to the work of Think Forward in the first place. So these two best friends, I've lived on uni campus with them. I've lived in awful share houses with them, sort of gone through all of that, formative stages of life stuff, so to say. They are now a couple. They have two young children. They work really big weeks, but they struggle to save anything, from their paychecks. And they told me on the weekend that the house that they're living in has just gone up for sale. So this will be this like the fourth house in about 5 years. So they inquired about their capacity to buy the home. It's just a small three-bedroom standard brick house about an hour out of the Gold Coast in the suburbs, and it's selling for $1 million. Their borrowing capacity wasn't so bad, but pretty short at just over $800,000. And the kicker is my two best friends are a plumber and a nurse. They have the good, secure, stable jobs that my generation grew up believing would provide us with everything that we need. And now my friends are worried about the instability of long-term renting, their lack of economic security into the long term, and just the wild amount of time that they need to spend working just to keep a roof over their kids' heads. I think, like, putting all of that aside, my two best friends cannot afford to live in their area, but our society needs plumbers and nurses to live everywhere. And it's really our tax system's preferential treatment for the accumulation of wealth as opposed to work that's created this really unsustainable economic situation. And at Think Forward, we're seeing sort of two camps of people. The first camp is a group of people that are giving up. They've seen the social contract that they rely on completely break down. I use this statistic all the time, but it's something that's 89% of millennials and Gen Z have given up chasing their dreams due to the cost of living crisis. And I use it all the time because I think it's a statistic that should terrify us. Um, the other camp is a group that we're seeing that we talk to that sort of feels like the only way to survive in the system is to participate in it. So if they're lucky enough to have the means, even if they might morally object to accumulating wealth or becoming a landlord or an investor just to get in the market, they're doing it anyway because they see it as the only way to get ahead. So I want us to have a third camp. And, that starts with creating an alternative for young people to look at, to see. And that starts with rebalancing our tax system to value work in the same way that it does wealth, or better yet, more than wealth. And I know that reforming the tax system isn't always, the most inspiring call to change. But what I have really grown to love about it is that it's a really practical tool to achieve all these big picture outcomes that we want. And I think it provides a really good roadmap for policymakers. So take, for example, what shifts to the capital gains tax discount might do. At Think Forward, we are calling for it to be completely abolished, not just reduced, because we think that income should be treated consistently, no matter how you earn it. And the most important thing that this would do is send a message that earning a living by providing a service or contributing to society is valued, and that investing in unproductive wealth is not the only way to get ahead. And it certainly isn't the way to get us out of this like productivity drag that we're in. Um, I think at the core, we really need our young people out there dreaming up business ideas and feeling economically secure enough to take a risk, like to take a creative or innovative risk on something that might better our planet or our society, instead of having, young 23-year-olds sitting around on the weekend inspecting the potential rental yields of an investment property or worrying about, panicking about their next rental increase. But yeah, I guess like back to being sort of practical about it, what might a shift to the capital gains discount tax discount mean for my two best friends? Is very likely to mean a decrease in the rapid growth in property prices, meaning they might actually be able to save a house deposit faster than the prices rise. Um, in that case, it might mean that the plumber feels confident enough to take a stab at starting his own business, employing more people, aiding with this like supply issue that we have. And it might mean that the $20 billion or so that is spent on the capital gains tax discount could be returned to the budget to invest in young families and give them some time back with their children. Um, I think I'm talking about the capital gains tax discount because we're all talking about it right now, but I hope it's just the first in a series of steps that are taken that, start to restore the faith for younger generations in that promise that going out and getting a job and getting an education is enough to build a dignified life, and especially one that lets us support the ones that we love. Um, so thank you. And yes, I'm out there just rooting for my best friends. So send them your well wishes. But Helen, I will pass it on to you.
Okay, thanks for that, Jane. So Jane's talked about the housing component of wealth, and in Australia, the two biggest components of wealth for most people are superannuation and housing. And these both skew to older people for obvious reasons. It's getting harder and harder for young people to get into the housing market. Their superannuation is a guarantee, it's there, but you can't draw on it until you retire. So looking at the purpose of superannuation, last year we finally, or 2 years ago, we finally got it legislated that there is a purpose for superannuation. And the objective of superannuation is to preserve savings to deliver income for a dignified retirement alongside government support in an equitable and sustainable way. And my argument is that at the moment, the way that the tax system supports superannuation is skewing the benefits to those who have the capacity to build a lot of wealth. So the tax incentives were there to encourage people to save. And in some cases, you can see the point of that. If people, sort of have to either consume or save, some people are more likely to consume. But what's happened is that the extent of the tax concessions has actually, it's not really encouraging the high wealth people. They could save anywhere. What it's doing is it's encouraging them to put their savings into a tax shelter. And that tax shelter, there are two main ones. One, of course, is superannuation, and the other one is capital gains because of the discount that's there. So it's estimated that by 2040, expenditure on superannuation concessions will exceed the spending on the age pension. It's sort of similar at the moment in 25, 26, and I've got this out of the tax expenditure and income statement. We're expecting that the tax concessions for super on contributions and earnings will total $60 billion, and the age pension is about $65 billion. So it's close. But this is the point. Whenever people talk about being a self-funded retiree, I laugh at them because they're not self-funded. They are getting a lot of support through the government. Um, so the contributions, if you ever want to have a look at some good data, the tax expenditure and income statements now produces these distributional charts, and it shows us that the concession on contributions goes 87% to people above the median income and 32% to the people, the top 10%. 61% of the concessions go to men. The concession on earnings, 79% goes to people above median income, 38% to the top 10%, and 60% goes to men. So there is a clear skewing here to old men. And although the data doesn't show race, I can almost guarantee you that the majority of those will be of an English background. So white, old white men. The other thing is that in 2007, John Howard introduced an exemption so that anybody who is over 60 who draws on their superannuation pays no tax at all. And my argument is that this has introduced not just the intergenerational inequity that Jane was talking about, but an intragenerational inequity. Because if you're on the age pension, you do pay tax on that. Most people think it's exempt. It's only exempt if it's below the limit at which a certain tax offset, which we call the senior Australian pension tax offset, it's only exempt if it's below that. As soon as you start to earn more income, for example, you take a part-time job, you work as a crossing attendant morning and afternoon at the school so that just to supplement your pension, that's taxed as well. And so you reach a point where if you earn more than, what's the figure? It's $216 per fortnight, plus $300 if it's labour market income, your pension starts to get withdrawn, you pay income tax, you start to pay Medicare levy, and you pay a massive effective marginal tax rate. And this is for those people who haven't had the opportunity to build wealth during their lifetime for whatever reasons. The other piece of data that's really interesting to look at is the difference between the mean, which is the mathematical average superannuation balance, and the median, which is what most people actually have, or the midpoint. And my calculations from the tax data show that the ratio is about double once you reach the age of 60 and over. It varies between age cohorts and between men and women, but about double, which means that there is a small number of very wealthy people who are getting massive tax concessions compared to what the average person is getting, even if they have reached a retirement and they have the median of $200,000 in superannuation. There is still this massive skewing that is going on at that level. So we definitely need reform. And to me, the reform is not just looking at high balance accounts, it's also looking at the difference between what people who get the pension pay in tax and what people who get the tax exempt superannuation pension pay in tax. So that's my little spiel. And so I will now hand over to Warwick.
Thanks, Helen, and thanks, Jane. I just had the bloody the little bar at the bottom of your screen pop up to cover my mute button. So it's the wrong time. So yeah, I'm going to talk, sort of focus a bit more on housing and perhaps sort of a bit outside of the tax conversation that the other two have mentioned, just to partly to bust some myths about what people say about housing, and mostly just to point out that the housing situation in Australia is a complex phenomenon, and the people who will tell you there's a really simple fix, like cutting red tape on construction or rezoning, or we just need to build more houses, the kind of standard things that people say about fixing housing affordability and availability are just not that simple. And including some of the political messages. We've heard Angus Taylor say multiple times recently, in reference to the capital gains tax. We haven't even got an announcement from the government, but there's various groups, including the opposition, who've already come out opposing any changes to capital gains tax. And what Angus Taylor says is, if you tax things, you get less of them. And capital gains tax is a tax on housing. And so if we increase the capital gains tax, we're going to get less houses. And, it's a really muddled message. And I think it's probably fair to call it a lie, because I think he knows that it's not true. And ultimately what capital gains tax is a tax on asset price speculation. And so he's sort of right. Mostly if you tax something, you get less of it. In this case, if you tax asset price speculation, so speculating on the price of a house, assuming that you're buying it, you're banking on the price going up and you're going to make money out of that. You tax that, you are actually going to get less people doing it. Less people buying housing purely for the capital gain. You get less people doing that. You're reducing demand for housing, which is part of the equation. There's the supply and demand. Everyone's talking about, all we need is more supply. That's the key answer. But there are actually demand level interventions, which are to a large extent probably more viable and more effective if you genuinely care about housing affordability. So you get investors who are buying for capital gains, as opposed to buying a property in order to rent it out and make the money from the rent and supply a service. If you're doing it for that and that's the reason you're making the money, then fine. You are sort of supplying a service. But if you're buying because of the capital gain, which a lot of people are, the rental returns, prices are so high that rental returns are actually pretty low. So most investors are buying because of that capital gain. You get people pulling out of the market, not being investors anymore. The other outcry we get is, well, it's going to reduce the supply of rental properties, and then rents will go up, et cetera, of course, which is sort of another one of these bizarre arguments, which in the background sort of assumes these houses disappear. The investors sell them and they're gone. But actually, of course, if you're getting a net reduction in investors, the only people who could be buying those houses are people who are going to live in them. If it's other investors, then you're not getting a net reduction. So you're also taking people out of the rental market into owning. And so it's an equal reduction in supply of rental properties, but a reduction in demand for rental properties at the same time, because owner occupiers are buying them. So there's just lots of scare campaigns from the Property Council. The Property Council is one of those groups who are saying, you're going to drive rents up if you do this because investors will pull out, and just a little bit of critical engagement with those arguments shows they're pretty hollow. But ultimately, I think, the biggest barrier to action on housing affordability is the political saleability of actually bringing house prices down. So we've had the Housing Minister Claire O'Neil say, what we ideally want is sustainable house price growth. And when pressed by some journalists about what that actually means, what we define sustainability, it just avoids the answering the question, because there's sort of talk about keeping house price growth below wage growth. And so, if you could manage that, walking that tightrope of a line very, very slowly over time, you improve overall housing affordability. But of course, the sort of million or so people who own investment properties, they don't want house prices to fall. But I do think this political problem is becoming more approachable as more younger people are locked out of housing. And I do feel like, even 5 years ago, there was a sort of, younger generation and advocates for the younger generation who were seeing housing price become unaffordable, who were attempting to advocate for change, and were in a minority and could be dismissed politically, basically. But I think we've reached a point now where even a lot of the people who have benefited from house price growth, including investors, see that the system's broken, see that their kids can't afford houses. The only way that their kids can afford houses is if they help them. And so I think there's just a much broader acknowledgement across the community that the system's broken and something needs to be done about it. So I do think there are opportunities, and that is probably why this capital gains tax change is being mooted. We'll see. The Treasurer keeps talking about ambitious tax reform and so on in this coming budget. So, I do think we're still hopeful that there will be positive changes. But of course, they will not make very significant changes that cause house prices to fall significantly. They won't do that on purpose, because the outcry would be huge, and the impact on people, particularly who have just bought and have very large mortgages and then potentially have negative equity. They have a loan that's bigger than the price of the house. They're really challenging things to be managed in this. I'll just say one more thing, and we can sort of delve into any of these things in the discussion. But the other thing about supply is kind of matching demand with supply, and about the sort of state of our housing stock and about the cost of moving house. So we have, I don't have the sort of figures at my fingertips. We have an extraordinary number of people who are living in houses that have more rooms than they need. And the challenge for a lot of people, particularly, people whose kids have grown up and left home, they live in their suburb, they have their community, they want to stay in the area, but a sort of combination of stamp duty and available appropriate housing and all of these things make it actually just really hard and really onerous to move house. And so people tend to just stay. They'll stay in their big house that's far too big for them, when, just down the road, there might be a family living in a tiny house, squeezed with 3 kids in a bedroom and wanting this bigger house that next door is available. And they would, I think in many situations, they would quite happily swap if it wasn't for the sort of the legal and the financial and the, even just the physical thing of moving is pretty onerous, especially for older people. So yeah, we have this sort of mismatch of housing use as well. That is a sort of supply and demand solution, without actually building more houses, is to sort of have this housing stock better used. Yeah, I'll stop there. There's plenty of other things to talk about.
Well, thanks to all 3 of you, because it was great insight, and we will be cheering on your friends, Jane, to make sure they can get a house where they work. But it was great to show how it works in real life, this inequitable economy that we have. It's interesting too, because one of the things that I found from moving from the States to Australia, many decades ago, was that houses are like an investment here. And they are probably in America a little bit more than when I was living there, but it was like a home in America. There was a mindset that this is, putting down your roots, it's your home. And here, like in every single dinner conversation I would go to, it was all about housing prices and where you were going to buy and what was the next place, and like the airtime that takes is just amazing. I don't know if we'll have anything to talk about if we sort out this issue with housing. But the other thing I noticed too is that as I travel, I'm a bit of a traveler. Travel's my muse. Love seeing and being in different cultures and learning from other people. And in the past 2 years, every single country I went to, every single city I went to, everyone was complaining about the housing crisis. So it is not just an Australian crisis. And I think for those of you that saw Gary's economics, the way he kind of posed that was, and I'll just go through this and hopefully I've got the numbers right. But he basically said a billionaire will, if they're earning 5% on their investment, their passive income, that would be approximately $1 million a week that they would have to spend. And they can't spend that much. There's the absorption rate of that kind of money into lifestyle spending is kind of hard. So, not kind of hard, it's very difficult. So where do they put their money? And that's in assets. And that includes housing, and it includes property, and it includes stocks and gold and everything else that they can put it in. So because there's this upward spiral of the growth of their income from passive income, and capital begets capital, as opposed to what Jane is saying, instead of, working for that income and what you're actually contributing to society, that this is what drives all of our asset prices up. So it's not just housing. So I think that's really an interesting point. And I'll throw it back to you three. And I encourage any questions in the chat now, please. That would be great. Or hands also, if you're on, is what's, there's a lot of talk about wealth tax. It's not necessarily, I mean, there's a bit of talk in Australia, but it's probably more overseas, I think. But Jane, I know that Think Forward is talking about this, and I know, Helen, you've looked at this too, and Warwick, you're all across it. So I'd like to throw it back to you. Is a wealth tax something we should be talking about more and looking at? So I don't know who wants to answer first. Jane, how about you?
Sure, I'll take a stab. I'll say that at Think Forward, we don't have a particular, like, we haven't landed on a stance as of yet. I think a lot of it is around because of the fact of how difficult it would be to implement. I think it's Zach Polanski in the UK is talking about, it would only work if it was a global,
Mm,
joined force. And the likelihood of that seems small. But, I think within that, it's the question of unrealized gains as well. And I know I said to you yesterday, Di, that I'm sort of thinking about it in terms of thresholds, and I would love Helen maybe to to give some insight on that. Like if we were to do it, I think I would prefer to see it at a certain threshold so that it's that limitation angle of like stopping that inequality gap from growing so big. There's a limit on it. So if your unrealized gains are hitting over 1 million or whatever number that we chose, like that's when a wealth tax on unrealized gains would come in. But yeah, I would really actually love to hear Helen's take
Yeah.
on that.
Well, there are a few countries in the OECD that still have a wealth tax. Now, just to distinguish here, a wealth tax, strictly speaking, is one that looks at the assets that somebody holds at a particular point in time. What we have as a capital gains tax is one that we tax at the point in time when you realise that asset.
mm,
So I think there's about, I did look this up, but I haven't got the number in front of me. I think it's about 16 countries in the OECD still have some level of wealth tax. Oh, sorry, got that round the wrong way. They have inheritance taxes, but the number imposing wealth taxes has reduced significantly over the last couple of decades. And part of that is the shift to capital that we've seen across the world. There are two main challenges with imposing a wealth tax. One is measuring it. So some of the challenges there involve having to actually assess a person's wealth at the point in time when it's going to be assessed and at the difference in that between point A and point B. And the second one is making sure that people actually have the resources available to pay that tax. Now, when you're talking about wealth in shares and other fairly, fungible and liquid type assets, that's not really a problem. But if you're talking about wealth that is tied up in your one and only residence, or it's tied up in a productive business, then realising the cash to pay that wealth tax becomes a problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's been retreated from basically around the world. Inheritance taxes, on the other hand, I think that's a really good idea because you've got a point in time. You have to have a valuation to sort out the estate. And at that point in time, you can start to look seriously at taxing the wealth that's handed on. One of the things I didn't say in my spiel earlier was that most people with significant amounts of super actually tend to accumulate that in retirement. And some calculations I did with an actuarial colleague show that if you use the standard rates of drawdown, most people's superannuation balance peaks at age 84, which is just about the life expectancy of both men and women, a little bit each side of age 84. So that is the challenge. And I think the point there is that we really do need to say that the transfer of that wealth is the point at which we should be imposing a tax.
Warwick, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with Helen about inheritance tax as a kind of a wealth tax that is an implementable thing. And I think, you know, broadly acknowledged at least that an inheritance is sort of an unearned income. But of course, there's enormous rebellion against such things as well in terms of inheritance taxes, because the idea is, of course, I have the right to pass my wealth on to my kids. And but I think the other one that's supported by a lot of economists is a land tax, which is a type of wealth tax, but is a particular type of wealth tax that, so the idea here is a tax on the unimproved value of the land, and the land is the primary source of capital gains on housing. So, the value of a building tends to go down over time because of wear and tear, and whereas the value of the land tends to go up. And while you can actively do things that increase the value of a building by renovating and et cetera, the change in the price of land has nothing to do with the landowner. It's entirely to do with what happens in the community, the broader economic conditions, and in particular, infrastructure improvements. There've been a few really interesting studies. One particular one in London, looking at the extension of the Piccadilly line. This is quite an old study now, that showed that the cost of these extensions enormous to the government, but actually this particular one resulted in 3 times the rise in land values of properties within a few hundred meters of the new stations. And so all the government would have to do is tax a third of that increase that the owners did nothing to gain. They just happened to have to own properties in a place where government was building infrastructure. Tax a third of that gain, the extensions would pay for themselves. And so there's a sort of uplift taxes, which the Victorian government has done a bit of. And then there's also just sort of broad-based land tax. And one of the things a lot of people advocate for is replacing stamp duties with annual land taxes, which gets rid of that sort of one-off lump of tax payment at transaction time and replaces it just with an annual fee based on the value of the land, which helps to overcome what I was talking about before in terms of barriers to moving house, but also is again a sort of tax on speculation. So you end up paying more tax the more your land values go up. So I think those are other ideas in terms of how we could change the system.
Mike, I'll get to you next, but I'm just going to take one from the chat. Adrian, you say the tax not being paid by big companies is a huge one. Gary Stevens said something, if we actually put more money into our tax recovery offices or departments, that the return on investment on that is huge. I think we have done some of that in Australia in the last few years, and I know that it's increased, but is it enough? And then Dan's question, how do each of you think about the intended and unintended impacts of home ownership policies like the lower deposits or first home buyers accessing super to qualify for a mortgage? So I'll put that up to you guys.
I'd love to take that if that's
Sure.
okay. Because I just used a 5% deposit scheme in December to purchase my first home. And I was very lucky. And the short answer is that it's awful. Just like obviously, on an individual level, great. I was able to use it. It benefited me wonderfully. But we already seen house prices rising dramatically since they've introduced that. And the other really, really, really important point to make is that it's not matching reality. Even this poor policy is not even matching the reality of what's going on. So, for example, my 2 best friends that I just spoke about, the price cap to use that 5% to buy scheme in their area is 800,000. There aren't any houses available under 800,000. And it was the same here. I live in a small regional town and price cap of 800,000. There were 2 properties on the market for under 800,000. I managed to get one, but what about everybody else? So they're just like, they're poor policies in general, but they actually just aren't even reflecting the reality of the situation.
Yeah, I would just say that I think that the problem there is that we need to work on both sides of the market. We need to not only enable people to access the market, but we also need to deal with the supply side issue. And I'm not in the camp that says everything is about supply, but I do think that at the moment the prices are escalating. I mean, I have in our extended family, we have somebody whose their grandfather has been able to give each of them a house deposit. And the prices that they had to pay to actually buy a house each, it was just astonishing to me. The supply is just not there in the lower range, and we have to deal with that.
Mm. I might go to you, Mike. You had a question?
Yes, talking about billionaires and wealth tax, we have in Australia had wealth tax and probate in the past fairly effectively. Di, you said there were 48 billionaires in Australia. There are, in fact, 161, and that figure is in Australian dollars. The 48 is the US dollar figure. So there's been an enormous growth in billionaires. And billionaires tend to have at least three characteristics. The first is that they don't pay tax. The second is that they are dynastic and that they pass wealth on to create dynasties of wealth, I guess. And the third is that they tend to increasingly use their wealth to interfere in politics. Mm. But it seems to me that there's the notion of somehow reviving various forms of wealth tax, inheritance, and so on. And the other thing about many billionaires today in Australia is that the wealth comes from, and globally, the wealth comes from new technology. And they become wealthy simply because of the monopoly that a small group have in the development of things like AI and so on and so forth. And we allow that to happen. So we don't socialize that, even though all of the work that led to these new devices that are so lucrative is public, mostly. Most of it is public research, which is simply captured. So I think we have to tackle that problem. On the second question of housing, I think most of the solutions that people talk about are politically unacceptable and are radical, although I certainly support them. I mean, the problem seems to be essentially that people's capacity to pay for housing is way out of kilter with the actual price of housing. And the price of housing reflects primarily housing as an investment. The government has happily gone along with that so that housing is traded and the price goes up and up and up. People's earning capacity, their capacity to get deposits and so on. So we've either got to keep that price down, or we've got to provide more funding for people to be able to buy into housing. I don't think it's a supply and demand problem, but ultimately I think it comes from treating housing as a human right, which it is. I mean, we've signed up conventions that say that, but we don't treat it that way. We treat it as essentially an investment. And until that mentality becomes more pervasive, I don't think we're going to see the changes, because politicians are incredibly cowardly about it.
Yeah. Good points. Good points, Mike.
And I think one of the things we haven't talked about is public housing. And, you know, in the 1950s, 20% of the houses were being built by the government, and then supplied to people long-term, affordable. These days, the government is mostly, mostly they've been selling off their housing assets, and so the sort of supply of public housing, and even we don't even talk that much about public housing anymore. It's more the term social housing has sort of replaced it, which is not. Which is a mix of public and privately provided affordable housing. But another solution is just for the government to own more houses and build more houses, and I think that's sort of a viable and important part of the mix.
And this, of course, feeds into what I was saying before about the intragenerational inequality. Once you're retired, if you don't own a home and you're still paying rent and you can't get into public housing, you are even further behind the 8 ball in terms of being able to live a dignified life.
I think these are all super valid points, and I'm just going to acknowledge Kevin. Would love to connect with you after this call, or in the next few days, because I'd love to hear about that work that you're doing. Um, and just kind of go back to it's not all about housing, our inequity. So Jeff has asked, what about incentives to move from speculative investments to the real productive economy? I think that's a beautiful question to ask you three.
I might sort of make a comment on this because we've talked about the capital gains discount issues in the context of how it distorts the housing market. But the discount was originally introduced as part of the RALPH reforms, which were all to do with productivity. And the basis was meant to be that we would encourage people to invest into productive enterprises. That hasn't happened in the way that was expected. So I think that in terms of what reforms are needed in the capital gains tax space, I really do think we should start looking at the different classes of investment so that there are some forms of investment where removing the discount could have an impact on investment into these areas that are going to generate productivity and productive growth. And they probably still warrant special consideration compared to the passive investment that we see with capital gains with the residential housing market, the small investors, portfolio type shares. They don't have the same productivity impacts as somebody who is putting up the venture capital for a particular development of something that is going to improve productivity in Australia. So that's my perspective on it.
Mm-hmm. Work, Jane, you want to add to that? Add anything to that?
It's funny because it's Tom and I have been going back and forth on pretty much exactly this question. Tom, my colleague at Think Forward, and I think Tom's argument that I don't necessarily disagree with, that we shouldn't be relying on the market to provide, essential public goods like housing, or we should use the transfer side of our tax system to grants and things like that to incentivize productive investment. But I personally don't. I do see the tax system as sort of an influencer, so they will, it influences our behavior, and I am definitely would be open to having, encouraging investment through the tax system in other areas. I think it just we have to think about the question, if we're separating out asset classes, like we still have to deal with the question of who's able to access those benefits. And right now, it would still likely be the wealthy folk as opposed to everybody else. So we've got to figure out a way to manage that, I guess, if we were to do it.
Mm.
I think I would just sort of reiterate some of the comments about land taxes. Land taxes are a way to divert investment from what economists call economic rent, which is a sort of confusing term because it doesn't mean the sort of rent that you get from a house. Economic rent generally refers to unearned income, and it's usually unearned income that results from kind of market power or monopoly control over a particular thing. And in this case, it's sort of, when we talk about land, it's monopoly control over a piece of the earth. And your capacity to say who can or cannot use or enter that piece of land. And so there are other types of economic rents which involve sort of market power, like the supermarkets have, because it's concentrated. The banks have, because they've got a banking license. There are many types of economic rents. The use of the electromagnetic spectrum, where we actually quite efficiently capture the sort of economic rents for electromagnetic spectrum by auctioning the spectrum to private users. So we sort of get the government gets a sort of higher return for allowing people monopoly over particular spectrum for the phone. This is primarily the phones, of course, these days, and data. So yes, rent taxes are very economically efficient and do redirect investment from rent seeking, seeking unearned income to sort of productive investment.
There's a few bits on the chat that lead me to, I think, maybe our final question, because and I'm sorry I can't get to all of them, and some of them I see that, like with you, Craig, it's great information for us to know. I'm not going to be able to read this last one with Richard, but I will try. One of the things is, this is the Wellbeing Economy Alliance Australia that's putting on this talk. So in our 4 Ps of prevention, predistribution, people powered, and purpose. There's also a lot of thinking around co-ops and community and community wealth building, which is kind of some of what we're talking about with community land trusts like Saul's put in, or maybe even nonprofit entities to own and manage housing. So I'm going to start with you, Warwick, because you might kind of set the scene a little bit on how can well-being economy mitigate this inequality or make our economy more equitable. I'll go it on a more positive light.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a big question, and the wellbeing economy crosses lots of different areas. But the sort of fundamental focus of wellbeing economy thinking is how do we construct an economy that serves people and serves the environment, instead of the situation we currently have where the framing is often about us serving the economy. What can we do? What can government do that will lift economic growth, that will lift productivity, and there's sort of these economic goals that seem to be spoken of as if they're a good in themselves and an end in themselves, and that we must do these things. We must have a sort of change the labour market conditions so that economic growth rises. And even if actually what that's code for is making people's jobs worse, when in fact, the sort of wellbeing economy framing is how do we shape the economy so that it serves us? And that plays out in many different ways. But a big part of the sort of wellbeing economy thinking is, asking questions about systems and about long-term, and being able to make long-term decisions. It's another sort of fundamental problem with government is short-termism. Is that it's very hard for them to think beyond election cycles and beyond budget cycles. And so we at CPD work with governments to sort of build processes into their budgeting that allows them to do long-term thinking, to sort of book long-term savings from preventative measures and things like that, and to think about how systems interact. So, that's a sort of complex, not very specific answer to your question, but I suppose most of the things that we've been talking about are things that you would bring into wellbeing economy thinking, most of the stuff that we've been talking about today. Just that those sort of tweaks that make the system work better for average people as opposed to the rich, and I think that state capture, corporate state capture is a big part of the issue that we're grappling with, which is that we have the sort of large corporate interests who've got hold of government and got government afraid to make decisions that are against their interests and perhaps in the interests of sort of ordinary citizens.
Jeff says authoritarian, you know what I mean? Governments can do long-term planning. And it's like, you know what? Our government can too, because we do it in defense and we do it in transport. So we can do long-term planning here too. We're just choosing not to at this point. And Richard, we talked about this in our planning for the session about a sovereign fund and the fuel subsidies and how the resource rent tax isn't enough. And I think that's something that we can probably add to this mix that we haven't spoken about today. And Craig, duplication in government is massive. So yeah, totally agree with you there. Shrav, we've got technology has taken us towards abundance, but ordinary cannot reliably. Central policy is next step is no longer production, but distribution, access, and bargaining power. Do you want to talk more about that, Shrav, or are you good with just that? Yep, there you are.
Hi, this is just, I think, a question for the panel, really. I mean,
Mm,
the the it's a little while away, but the folks in Silicon Valley would make us believe that, AI, robotics, and technology is going to take us light years ahead in terms of productivity, which hasn't increased overall over the last 20 years. And so, to that end, if that promise does come to fruition, is it a case of, well, there is abundance and we all can sort of, have live more meaningful lives and do less? And is it more a case of access, distribution, and who gets what and access to it? I think as Mike was kind of, talking about as well. Um, and typically as Labour governments are concerned, more bargaining power for the average Australian to say, we demand and need access to it, rather than, a series of small, simple policy changes around
mm,
either a land tax or an inheritance tax. But how do we kind of distribute this widely across to everyone to provide that equal opportunity? I know it's never going to be equal at a point in time.
mm. Yeah, thank you. Good point. Um, any thoughts, Helen or Jane, to close off on
Yeah.
well-being economy?
Well, I think that one of the challenges that we have is that as we are moving into a services economy, and most of the things that we need to live, to support well-being are based around services, health, NDIS, all of these really big budget lines. And yet we have parts of the political system framing those as costs. Whereas what we should be saying is these are benefits that we get from living in Australia, and we should be prepared to pay for those. And if that means that we need to review our tax system to be able to pay for them, then that's what we have to do.
Mm, mm. Thank you, Helen. Jane, anything?
Yeah, just to wrap up on Helen's point, exactly that. We always hear that we don't have money for this, we don't have money for that, but really we do, and it actually just starts with rebalancing the tax system, in my opinion, to tax more wealth, and put that back into the budget for the things that we need. And I think that's probably one thing to be really cautious of. I think when we have these broader conversations about like tax reform, for example, a lot of everyday Australians will automatically make the assumption that we're talking about them being taxed more.
Mm.
And I think if there's one thing that everyone on this call could do when those conversations come up is make that point clear that that's not what we're talking about. So don't shut off immediately from it, because we're actually trying to make things better for you.
Thank you, Jane. That is a perfect segue into my closing remarks, and that is that one of the key takeaways from Gary's talk was, which he drilled in a lot to us when we were there listening to him, was it's up to us. It's up to you and me and everyone on this call to be talking to people, just like you said, Jane, to be calling, visiting, writing, emailing our members so they know what we're thinking. And people do have power. You've looked at look what happened in Nepal. Like it. And Craig, who's a union, he knows people have power. This is just a given. So, it's great that you're here because you're interested and you're already halfway across, and I bet you're already talking to people. But when these comments, these throwaway media bites that happen with Angus Taylor and the taxing, we need to go out and email the media and say that's wrong. You need to look at this part of this quote instead. So I guess for us, we see this is people powered. One of the P's of well-being economy. We as the people need to be bringing up all these changes that we need to make our economy more equitable and to make our young generations, our younger generations, to have just as a beautiful time living in Australia as we have, and for great, great, great grandchildren. And so it's up to us. And I want to thank everyone for coming today and listening, and keep in touch. Join WEAll if you haven't already. ask us any questions, email us. We'll be sending out the recorded video, so you guys have that too. So again, thank you so much and have a great rest of your day. Thank you.